conservation. That is the theme we're having for this semester. The schedule for all of the seminars is out on the side table for those here and on our website for those who are listening live to the broadcast. And in case you can't attend the seminars ever, we do broadcast them live and record them and archive them on our website. Usually it takes about a week after the presentation date for that to be posted on the website. But we have over 140 seminars there from the past 8 years on a lot of different sustainability topics. So as we begin, I want to remind everyone here in attendance to please silence your cell phones. Also, we'll hold all questions for the speaker until the end of her presentation. She will be conducting this webinar from New York, but we will then switch on, and you can, for those viewing online, you can type in questions at any time, and then we'll answer those at the end also. So today I'm very pleased to have with us Dr. Sherri Mason, who is Professor of Chemistry and also the Environmental Sciences Program Coordinator at the State University of New York at Fredonia. Dr. Mason gave a talk a couple years ago to us about some of the work she was just beginning at that time on the Great Lakes and microplastic pollution. And today she'll give us an update on some of that work. Her research group has been at the forefront of the research on plastic pollutions within freshwater ecosystems in general and the Great Lakes more specifically. They currently have related plastic pollution projects going on at wastewater treatment facilities to examine them as a source of plastics to rivers and lakes. They're assessing the migration of plastics into the food web. They're conducting stream sampling to determine the influx of plastics via that route into the Great Lakes, and they're also doing sediment analysis to see if that's a sink for many of the plastics. So with that, I'm going to turn the program over to Dr. Mason. Sherri, are you ready to switch screens? And we'll let you get started.
I think I have already switched the screen. Is it showing up over there?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
So it should be fine to start. Thank you very much.
Okay. Well, thank you all for being here to listen to me again. As Nancy mentioned, I did give a webinar through this agency before. At that time, I explained what plastic was and the context for the problems with plastic. So I don't want to review that material in case we do have people that have heard me present before. So today, I want to focus on giving an update to the current state of the science with regard to the Great Lakes. So I really should have called this freshwater plastic pollution. But to start, I wanted to give a background, a life cycle, if you will, of plastic pollution. So, starting with how plastic ends up in our water. Ultimately, it's coming from litter, whether intentional or wind-blown debris, so unintentional, releases into the environment. And this could happen along, a shoreline when we go to the beach, or it could happen while we're walking down the street or at the grocery store. Right, a plastic bag goes blowing out of your car. You don't want to take the time to catch it. It makes its way down a storm drain, and then it can be deposited into a waterway. We tend to think of this as happening with big items, but I think increasingly we're becoming aware of the fact that this isn't just, big items that get washed on the storm drain, but really, really small pieces too, right? As those pieces of plastic are lying along the side of the road, say, somebody throws a soda bottle out of the car when they're done with it, and it gets driven over by other cars before a storm event washes all of the pieces of that plastic item down the storm drain. And so you have these little pieces of plastic that make their way through these discharges as well. So ultimately, right, you have litter that leads to runoff, that leads to discharges into body of water, and that's how the plastic gets there. And then the question is, well, what happens to it once it's there? Plastic is an amazing material, but it has very unique properties relative to other materials, in that it doesn't And one of those properties is the fact that it doesn't biodegrade. It undergoes what we call photodegradation. So under the action of sunlight and mechanical action like wind and waves, you know, cars driving over it, it will break into smaller and smaller pieces, but it doesn't biodegrade, so it won't completely mineralize for estimates are anywhere from decades to centuries, depending upon the type of plastic that you're talking about. So it undergoes a photodegradation process rather than a biodegradation process. And so you get increasing concentrations of these microplastics in the environment as these big plastic items break into smaller and smaller pieces. Then you have things like what I'll refer to as beaching, right? Whereas the particle or the plastic item is in the water, it can wash up during a storm event onto a beach. And then during the next storm event or a lighter rain, it can slowly make its way back into the water. And so you'll have these beach items that will basically kind of hopscotch down the beach, down the Great Lakes as they make their way through the chain. And along the way, right, when they're up on the beach, they're drying out, they're becoming more brittle, they're exposed to increased sunlight. And so then when they wash out the next time and under the action of that, you know, wind and water wave action, they will break into these smaller and smaller pieces along the way. While they're in the water, probably one of our biggest concerns with regard to plastics is the fact that they do absorb chemicals out of the water, things like polychlorinated biphenyls or PCBs. These were banned in the 1970s because of their known human health impacts, but they still exist in you know, significant concentrations in the water, and work by some associates of ours have shown that the plastic that we've pulled out of Lake Erie has high concentrations of PCBs absorbed to the surface. Similarly with PAHs, or polyaromatic hydrocarbons, another group of compounds that are hydrophobic in nature, so water-fearing molecules. So while they're in the water, they don't want to be, and they will absorb to the surface of the plastic in order to move from that aqueous or water environment, move out of that aqueous or water environment. Plastic will also build up what are called, you know, biofilms. So little critters will live on the surface of the plastic, much like how we live on the surface of this planet, forming what's been referred to as the plastosphere. And ultimately, the concern with regard to plastic is what happens to it at the end of its, you know, life cycle, as I'm calling it here, and that is, you know, ingestion. That it can be ingested by organisms that live in the water, and then the plastic acts as a means to move those chemicals that we were talking about earlier, move them from the water into the food web. Another kind of end cycle or end point for plastic is the fact that it can sediment, right? Sediment out of or fall out of the water and get buried in the sediment, so sedimentation. So that's kind of what we're looking at here is kind of, you know, what happens to plastic, and today I kind of want to go through an overview of the data that we have on all of those different aspects of the plastic life cycle. So I'll start by talking about some of the beach data that we have. And I say we, I'm using a collective we here. Some of this is work that I've done and my research group has done. Some of it is work that has been done by some of my colleagues, some of my associates. Specifically the beach data, I don't do any beach surveys. So we'll start with the beach surveys, and then we'll I wanted to initially go from there to talking about the river work that we've been doing, the tributary work, but because a lot of that tributary work makes reference to the open water data, I'm going to have to reverse the order. So I'll go from talking about the beaches to talking about our open water surveys, and then that led into the river surveys or the tributary work, and as part of one of those tributary studies we did some analysis on the biofilms that exist on the plastic within the Great Lakes. So I'll make reference to that, and then ingestion and you know, how, if the plastics are making their way into the food web and to what extent, and then ending with sedimentation. So basically following that life cycle, very similar. And then we'll end with just kind of a really quick overview of, you know, where are we going with all of this? What else needs to be done? So starting with our beaches, all of the papers I'm going to make reference to are kind of the most current papers that we have out on these topics. So the first paper here is from Patricia Corcoran's group out of the University of Western Ontario. She was actually the first one to look at plastic pollution in the Great Lakes, and that she did the first beach surveys on it. And then I'll be making reference to Tom Holian's work in this similar regard. So Patricia's group, Dr. Corcoran's group, started by doing some beach surveys up in Lake Huron. This was actually in response to citizens kind of being concerned by the number of these plastic pellets or pre-production pellets, or nurdles as they're called, washing up onto the shores because of a train derailment that actually happened actually off of Lake Superior, but basically the idea is that the pellets then washed into Lake Huron. So people along Lake Huron and Georgian Bay were complaining about these pellets, and so she started doing a significant number of pellets within her first beach surveys, and then kind of decrease as you move up from the south end of the lake going northern, and they tied this in with currents, dominant currents that would kind of, if the source was here, would kind of push them northward, but you would see a decreasing trajectory as you move north along the beach front. So they connected what they're finding on the beach to sources, but also to lake currents, which is a theme that you see kind of throughout this work. Then the water from Lake Huron, flows into Lake St. Clair on its way to Lake Erie. So this is their beach survey data from the beaches around Lake St. Clair. You'll notice that there's a whole lot less pellets. You're seeing much more intact pieces, much more fragments, polystyrene. They tied this into the fact that the water flow through Lake St. Clair is fairly quick. It's a small lake, and so the water very small and shallow, and it's used largely, there's a lot of transportation. That's what the dotted line is. That's the transportation pathway through the lake, going from Lake Huron in the north to Lake Erie in the south. And so you have a pretty fast-moving, relatively fast-moving water, so you'll notice that the counts of plastic are significantly smaller than what you see in Lake Huron. But also there's a lot of break walls within Lake St. Clair to decrease erosion from the beach surface, and that reduces the ability of plastic to then wash up on the shores. And then going from Lake St. Clair into Lake Erie, you see those pellets coming back again, as well as a significant number of fragments, and the counts, the amount of plastic is increasing as well as we go to slightly slower water movement, allowing for more beaching of the plastic debris out of the lake. Here I'm going to move on to Tim's work out of Loyola Chicago. He was looking at 5 beaches around Lake Michigan, using data collected by citizen science campaigns as part of the Alliance for the Great Lakes Adopt a Beach program. So these are, citizens that go out a few times a year and do beach surveys, and then there's a repository of data on the Alliance for the Great Lakes. And so there's, he makes reference in the paper to the pros and cons of using citizen science data. But I think it provides a nice complement to Corcoran's work. What we see in the beach survey data is that the majority of what they were finding on the beaches was food-related and smoking-related leftovers, litter. So food wrappers, cigarette butts were the dominant types of debris that they were finding. They also found that the counts were on the low end, but comparable to what you see along beaches, along the oceans. And if we tie, excuse my crude way of doing this, but I'm going to tie Corcoran's numbers in here, add them onto this graph. You see that Patricia's group kind of, again, it really kind of, you see that what we're finding in the Great Lakes is very comparable to what's being seen in the world's oceans. So kind of just to wrap up this part, We see the Great Lakes density, so the amount of plastic debris we see on our beaches in the Great Lakes are comparable to what we're seeing in the world's oceans. These densities are affected by wind and water currents. That's where I really pointed that out with regard to the Lake Huron data. Also attributed to the proximity of the sources, right? So when you're close to a source, you tend to find higher counts. And shoreline properties. One of the things that was pointed out in these papers was the difference between sandy beaches and more gravel beaches, right? Sandy beaches, you're going to find more people going to them as a Sunday afternoon activity, and you see a lot more litter that's kind of left behind as a consequence of that. When you have more gravelly type of material, it affects the plastic, the types of debris that you find left behind. Regardless, though, of that, the dominant type of debris is basically ermid waste, whether this is litter that's left over from beachgoers or stuff that's washing up because of storm events, that beaching that I was talking about at the very beginning, where things tend to wash up during major storm events and then wash out during less intense storm events. In terms of the types of plastic that we're finding, like the plastic polymers, polyethylene is the dominant plastic, followed by polypropylene, and this actually mirrors what we see with regard to the production of plastics as well. Polyethylene is the dominant type of plastic that's produced in the world, so the fact that we find it most common on the beaches isn't a surprise. And then Patricia's group has done a lot with regard to looking at the weathering or how the plastics are breaking apart, and they're seeing a more indication of mechanical weathering over oxidative weathering. Mechanical weathering would be things like the wind and the water pounding sand, scraping across it, those kind of weathering events, as opposed to the photooxidation, which is sunlight hitting the plastic, causing chemical reactions to break the polymer chain smaller. So we see more mechanical weathering over the oxidative weathering, which probably makes sense considering, one, we don't have as much sunlight as, say, the tropics, Hawaii or something like that. But we do have the freeze-thaw cycle of winter that will increase the mechanical degradation of these things, and she sees that with regard to the analysis that they've done on those particles. So next in line are open water data, and this kind of is the way that it happened in real life, where the beach survey data, Patricia's group was the first to kind of come out with that, and then we were the first to go into the open waters of the Great Lakes and survey them, and I'm going to kind of just present to you the data we have there. We've surveyed between 2012 2013. We have data on all 5 of the Great Lakes. I'm going to go through this quickly because I have presented it here before, but just to make sure that everybody sees the complete picture. In 2012, our first survey, we started up in Lake Superior. Average counts in Lake Superior were slightly higher than Lake Huron, though within a standard deviation, they're exactly the same. Basically about 7,000 plastic particles per square kilometer. What really blew us out of the water in 2012 was the number of plastic particles we found in Lake Erie. 90% of the plastic that we captured in 2012 was within Lake Erie. And on average, we see about 46,000 plastic particles per square kilometer along the surface of Lake Erie, which is quite high. 2013, we did a really extensive survey. Probably our best survey of any of the Great Lakes was within Lake Michigan. We have 85 samples from across the surface of Lake Michigan. You notice that there's a lot of dots down here. We expected, because we were sampling here in August, and there's a gyre that develops on the southern end of the lake during this month, so we thought we would find really high counts on the southern end of the lake, plus you have, Chicago and Gary, Indiana down here as potential sources. But actually what we found is that the plastic concentrations were fairly well distributed across the entire lake surface. We think that's because of the fact that the water within Lake Michigan, this is one of the longest residence times of any of the Great Lakes, 99 years on average. And so our thinking here is that basically the plastic has a chance to be evenly distributed across the lake surface, as opposed to focused in on the southern end of the lake. On average, 17,000 plastic particles per square kilometer. We did a second survey in 2013, and actually we've done a third survey in 2014, but that data isn't here. But you see that the counts that we had in 2012, we continue to see really high counts in 2013 to substantiate the fact that there are very significant abundances of plastic within the surface waters of Lake Erie. And kind of how Lake Erie blew us out of the water in 2012, Lake Ontario blew us out of the water in 2013. On average, the surface waters from our data, on average, the surface waters of Lake Ontario, 280,000 plastic particles per square kilometer on average. And that's larger than what you find in the world's oceans. It's absolutely huge. Our largest abundance to date was right outside of Toronto with 1.3 million plastic particles per square kilometer. And part of the reason we do see these high counts could be because of the fact that we were on a smaller vessel when we were doing this survey, and so we tended to be closer to the shore. Again, closer to the shore, you're closer to the sources, and so you might expect to see higher counts. Looking at all of our data combined for those 2 years, along the top here we have our different size classifications, so we separate things into basically 1/3 to 1 millimeter, 1 to 5, and then things that are bigger than 5 millimeters. The smallest two categories here would be what scientists refer to as microplastic. So microplastic is anything that's smaller than 5 millimeters. Along the left, we have our different types of plastic that we categorize things into, whether it's fragments, pellets, fibers or lines, films, and then foams like styrofoam. And what we see in looking at this data is that the dominant size classification by far, the microplastics, right, 96% overall, but the smallest ones, the things that are less than 1 millimeter, in this data table, 67%. If we incorporate 2014, we're up to 75% of the plastic. So 3/4 of the plastic that we're pulling out of the Great Lakes are particles less than 1 millimeter in size, incredibly small. And within that size category, the majority of them are fragments, right? Things that have photo-oxidized or broken apart from bigger plastic items. Pellets, these round plastic items which could come from facial wash or those pre-production pellets that we were talking about earlier. And then fibers are lines, things that come from like synthetic clothes when we wash them, or fishing lines, little fragments that are left over. So conclusions from this section of the talk, plastic abundances in the Great Lakes are comparable to, or in some cases higher than what we see in the world's oceans. The majority of these are incredibly small particles called microplastics, specifically those that are less than 1 millimeter in size. And the dominant pieces that we find are fragments and pellets. And remember this for later when I talk about rivers, because we see a difference when we're looking then at the rivers. So here I'm going to make reference to an initial survey that was done on one tributary, the North Channel of Chicago. And then that led to a larger regional study that is currently underway between my lab and the USGS. So I'll be making reference to both of those. So the first survey, this I did with my colleagues at Loyola Chicago, where we were looking in the North Channel of Chicago. And here I'll highlight the data that's from the channel as compared to the Great Lakes or the oceans. And we're really amazed at the concentration of microplastics that we see. Kind of indicated that actually rivers could have more plastic in them than these other bodies of water, which actually you're closer to the sources, it actually does really make sense. But this led to a larger regional survey. So we're looking at 29 tributaries into the Great Lakes between 6 different states. I'm looking at this, so at the time that this was put together, we sampled, we processed about 2/3 of the samples that we had collected. So do keep in mind that this is preliminary data, but currently the tributary, it supports the initial work of Tim Holian's group out of Loyola Chicago, that these tributaries or rivers represent a significant source of microplastics into the Great Lakes, and then when we get to larger bodies of water, the concentrations of microplastics decrease because of that dilution type of effect. In terms of the types, this is where I mentioned, in the Great Lakes, we're seeing mostly the fragments and the pellets, but in the tributaries, we're seeing way more within the fiber and line category. And this is regardless of the type of land use that is associated with the tributaries. So in this graph, we're basically going from less urban to more urban as we go across the graph, and you see that regardless of what land use is associated with that river, we continue to see that these fibers and lines dominate. But you do see an increase in our fragments and our foams as we move to these more urban associated rivers. And in total, these rivers do represent a significant source daily load of microplastics into the Great Lakes. So rivers represent a major source of microplastics to the Great Lakes, but there is a difference in the types of microplastics. In the Great Lakes, we see predominantly fragments and pellets, while in the rivers, we see predominantly lines and fibers. We think this difference may actually be associated with the density. So synthetic clothes are typically made out of things like polyester, which as a material, as a plastic, is actually more dense than water, so it should sink. So our hypothesis is that basically the turbulence of the rivers keeps these negatively buoyant particles suspended, but then as the rivers flow into the Great Lakes, those negatively buoyant particles would settle out or sediment, end up in the sediment, allowing the fragments and the pellets, which are positively buoyant, things made out of polyethylene and polypropylene that should float in water, those tend to remain aloft and then are captured in the open water data. So that's our current thinking. But we'll see here in a little bit that these fibers and lines are actually also the dominant type of plastic that we're finding in our food web assessments. So it could also be that as the fish are making their way upstream to procreate, that they're eating the fibers, and that's why we don't find them in the open water. But we'll have to test that out in time. So I did mention that as we were going through that initial North Channel Chicago study, we also did some analysis on the biofilms that built up on the plastic relative to the biota that was in the water column and on the organic matrix. So this is what this graph shows. We noticed that regardless of which kind of compartment of the environment we're looking at, we have very diverse bacterial assemblages. And that what we find on the plastic is very different than what we find on the organic matter, than what we find within the water column. It's quite interesting. Just wanted to kind of focus in on two of these, the two dominant ones within the plastic. We have, and I'm not a biologist, so please forgive my pronunciation, but Pseudomonas, which was 19% of all the sequences on the plastic, but less than 1% within the water column and organic material. So it was a dominant species on the plastic, but not so much within the water or on the organic material. What's interesting about this is that this taxa is actually, or genus, excuse me, is actually pretty well known to, there's evidence that it can actually utilize the plastic as a carbon source. So it may actually be there because of the fact that it can feed off of the plastic and may be helping to increase the biodegradation. Even though I said that plastics do not readily biodegrade, there are species that can biodegrade, and those species will favor being on the plastic relative to being on the in the water or on the organic material that we pull out. The other thing, the other dominant family that we found on here was the family Campylobacteriaceae, which is associated has multiple taxa that are associated with human gastrointestinal infections. And this could indicate these sequences were 4 times more abundant on the microplastic than within the water and 13 times more abundant than on the suspended organic material, and could indicate the fact that these plastics actually did make their way through wastewater treatment plants, and that's how these assemblages became so prominent on the plastic. So then looking at our food web, which is kind of one of the ultimate concerns with regard to the microplastics. At the time that I put together these slides, we had examined 17 species of fish and the double-crested cormorant with regard to presence of plastic within their gastrointestinal tract. We had 8 more to analyze, and here I've set those species up in kind of a food web with regard to, except for those 4 species that are listed at the top that don't really fit very well into our food web. So lower trophic level species, and then the arrows indicate whom eats whom. And the numbers in red represent the average number of plastics that we found per species. So the common shiner, on average, we found 3 particles of plastic within each fish that we analyzed. The species that do not have numbers, it's not that they didn't have plastic, we hadn't analyzed them at the time that this slide was put together. I can actually tell you that we've analyzed all 25 species of fish now, and every species of fish has some amount of plastic in it. The counts seem to increase as we move to higher trophic levels, right? So lower trophic level, 1 to 3 particles. Mid-level, we have somewhere between 5 and 8 particles, and then at the upper level, we see the double-crested cormorant has 36 particles of plastic on average. And that's total plastic, and then I already kind of indicated to you guys that the dominant thing that we're seeing within the fish are actually fibers rather than fragments or pellets. And we think that this is actually because the fibers become enmeshed within the gastrointestinal tract, so they become part of the GI tract, whereas the fragments and the pellets, I believe, are being excreted, and part of my belief in that is knowing the oceanic research that's been done. So these particles are ingested, but they're excreted after a period of time, say maybe 3 days. But the fibers, I think, are actually being retained by the organism. And the issue of that, of course, is that the longer that the particle is within the organism, the greater the ability that chemicals that are within that plastic can then desorb into the organism that eats them. So conclusions from here that microplastics are making their way into the Great Lakes food web. Counts are increasing with increasing trophic level, and fibers are the most abundant because of the fact that they're becoming enmeshed within the gastrointestinal lining, whereas the fragments and pellets, I think, are being excreted. And then lastly, overview of the plastic pollution life cycle, sedimentation. So this is another tie to Patricia Corcoran's group out of the University of Western Ontario. So she started with these beach surveys, and now she's starting to look within the lake sediment records. So taking box cores of lake sediment and looking within this sediment for plastics. And so her first report came out just literally a couple months ago. She was looking, these were from 2 samples from Lake Ontario. One was in the center of the lake. One was at the mouth of the Niagara River. And they took, they got these box cores, and then they took 2-centimeter slices as they moved down. And they didn't find any particles at depths greater than 8 centimeters. And based upon the deposition rate of sediment within Lake Ontario, then they estimate that the plastics started to be deposited along with the sediment layer of Lake Ontario about 38 years ago. Here, this table, we're looking at the number of particles that they're finding in each one of those slices. What is labeled as location 3 in our map is station 403 in the table, and what's labeled as 4 on the map is station 208 in the table. And what we see is, regardless of which station we're looking at, that we find more plastic in the upper layers, right? And then as we go kind of back in time to depths, to greater depths, we see that the number of particles is decreasing, which makes sense because more and more plastic is being produced every year, more and more plastic is ending up in the water therefore each year, and so you're going to see more and more plastic being deposited to the sediment layer of our lakes each year. In terms of the types of plastic, polyethylene, again, was the dominant type of plastic, followed by polypropylene, and then nitrocellulose is what's labeled NC here. And nitrocellulose is actually, cigarette butts are made out of nitrocellulose, so just to give you a context. So plastics began, kind of conclusions from this work, plastics began accumulating within Lake Ontario at least about 38 years ago. They tended to be more abundant at the center of the lake than at the mouth of the river. I should have pointed that out a little bit better in our slide here, but you'll notice that the counts at the center of the lake were slightly higher than at the mouth of the river. So station 403 has slightly higher counts than what we see in 208. And they attribute this to the fact that there is a slope from the as the Niagara River flows into Lake Ontario, the Niagara Bar, there's a 10-degree slope, and so basically things may tend to kind of fall off. And the river plume is diverted east, and again, the greater the turbulence of the water, the more likely that things are going to stay afloat. And since the river plume is diverted east, that means that in the center of the lake, the water is actually moving less quickly, and so that can allow for greater deposition or sedimentation of the plastics that are within the water. Polyethylene was the dominant type of plastic, followed by polypropylene. The dominance of those two types of plastic is very consistent with the beach surveys that we saw earlier, as well as with production rates. Remember that I indicated that polyethylene is the most predominant plastic that's manufactured in the world, followed by polypropylene. But what's interesting about the fact that they're in the sediment record is the fact that both of these plastics are actually less dense than water. And so you would expect them to stay afloat, but the longer that a piece of plastic is in the water, the greater the ability of those biofilms that we were talking about earlier to deposit or to grow, to colonize onto the surface of the plastic. And as those biofilms develop, that will increase the density of the plastic and therefore increase the probability that those plastics will become more dense than water and can then sediment, become part of the sediment record or basically deposit out. So biofilms might explain the sedimentation of this material, even though it's technically, in its pure state, less dense than water. Then with regard to future research needs, there's a lot. Consistent methodologies with regard to not only the quantification of the plastics, but also their detection, that is FTIR or Raman. So, because this is a fairly new field, there are still, different groups use different methodologies, and then that leads some question as to how comparable the numbers are. So, for example, we've been using a wet peroxide oxidation in order to separate the plastics from the organic material, the biological material, if you will. But we've found, for example, that cigarette butts, nitrocellulose, that is, will decompose in the wet peroxide oxidation because it is a semi-synthetic material. And so there's a new kind of enzymatic process that uses enzymes as opposed to hydrogen peroxide. And that may allow for decreased, interference from the chemicals on the quantification. So making sure that there's consistent methodology across all groups that are doing this type of work. As much data as we have on the presence of this stuff in the water, we still need more. We have all of 3 years of data on Lake Ontario and on Lake Erie, and 1 year of data on any of the other Great Lakes. And then the question that I frequently get is, are things getting better or worse? Well, we wouldn't know. we have such limited data that there's no way to really know. And then to understand the distribution of the plastic, we need more data within more data points in order to understand how that plastic is distributed across the lake surface. More information with regard to how that plastic is transported and factors that affect it. Like I said, we're seeing these high counts of fibers in the rivers. So that would indicate that those fibers are being transported by the rivers, but then it seems that we don't see them in the lakes. So then what's the factor? What is it accounting for that difference in the transportation? The extent of the impacts and the relevance of those impacts. So we know, for example, that the plastics are making their way into the food web, but what damage are they doing to the organisms that ingest them? If they're eating them and they're having no impact, then one might argue that it doesn't even matter that the plastics are there. I mentioned the fact that we know that plastics absorb POPs, persistent organic chemicals. Those are those PCBs and PHs that I was talking about. But there's a lot of data with regard to that within the Great Lakes. Lorena Rios Mendoza is the only group, her group is the only group that's done any kind of work on that, and the work is fairly limited. So more needs to be done with regard to their ability to absorb those POPs and then the ability of those POPs to desorb once they're ingested. We also need a lot more information with regard to how plastics degrade. How quickly are they breaking apart? I think one of the really surprising results from that, our initial 2012 Great Lakes Open Water Survey was how small the plastics were that we were picking out. We really thought going into that we would be catching things like bags and bottles, not little bits. And so it would seem to indicate that there's more mechanical degradation happening to these plastics before they end up in our water than we even realized, and that basically they're breaking into these microplastics a lot faster. So how quickly are they breaking into microplastics? What are the pathways by which that is oxidation versus mechanical? And what are the products? With regard to the oxidative processes, you have these polymeric chains going into smaller and smaller, you have pieces breaking off, releasing chemical substances. Well, what are those chemical substances, and is that are those products a concern with regard to the food web and things like that? So with that, I think I did pretty good on time. Yay! And I will open it up for questions.
Well, thank you very much, Sherri, for your good summary of all the work you've been doing and others are doing on plastics research in the Great Lakes. So I'll first ask here in our audience if anyone has a question.
So all the plastic that enters the ocean, so all of them do all of them cause break into microbeads, or is just from the cosmetic industry, the one mentioned in the 5 gyros?
Right, so yeah, microbeads are a specific type of microplastic, and they're basic, yeah, they're used in personal care products of various types in order to act as an abrasive. So they're formed as a microbead, they're used as a microbead, and they're released as a microbead. So the term microbead refers to those specific, and you can see actually some microbeads in the image that's currently up on the screen. These little round spherical balls that are typically colored, but the white, many of the white ones are also microbeads. So that's a specific type of microplastic. As a bigger plastic item, say the cap off of a soda bottle, as that breaks into smaller and smaller pieces, it forms microplastics, but they're going to tend to be fragments as opposed to pellets.
Another question here.
So does it mean that when so a microbead cannot be further mechanically degraded? Is that is it so small?
No, no. I mean, yeah. I mean, it can still be mechanically degraded. You're right. Probably the likelihood of it undergoing mechanical degradation as opposed to bio or photooxidative degradation is probably much smaller because it is such a small piece. But it can still undergo all of those different types of processes, and it will break into smaller and smaller pieces. It will continue to break down. You know, how long it takes, that's the question. You know, there's really very, very little data out there on how these plastics degrade, and none within freshwater systems.
Any other questions from here?
This was about plastics in water. Are there any concerns about plastic on land, especially in food production? A lot of plastic is used for greenhouses and a bazillion other things.
Well, I mean, the concern there is that, you know, as we cover greenhouses and plastic, right, and storm events, pieces of that can break off and get wind blown. So the concern about that is more of it being released because it's out there. I'm not concerned, and I don't know of anybody that's concerned that the plastic is making its way into our food, just because of the fact that it would have to get, you know, through the ribosomes, across so many cell membranes, and so I don't think you need to worry when you're eating an ear of corn that you're eating plastic. You know, so the concern is more how that plastic is used and where does it end up, right? Frequently, I think we think that we're disposing of plastic properly, but things get blown away by the wind all the time. Does that answer your question?
Another question from here.
Thanks for your talk. You know, my question is for the fishing. How do you detect microplastics in the fishing? I assume the microplastics not in the tissue, fish the tissue sample. So that's why I'm wondering, how do you think this will contaminate for the fishing? Go to the food web?
So that's a really good question, and you know, I'll refer back to the fact that I'm not a biologist. So when we went into that food web assessment, my concern was if the plastics were being eaten by the organism, and then, you know, the fact that those chemicals could desorb from the plastic into the fish. So I was more kind of interested in it from the standpoint of the chemistry than the biology. Recently, some really interesting articles have been coming out that kind of, you know, made me wish that I had you know, read about them earlier because they are, one, you know, they're looking at the fact that these smallest plastic pieces can actually migrate across the gastrointestinal tract and end up in the meat of the fish, the part that's actually eaten. That hadn't occurred to me, so you know, we never tested any of the meat of the fish, nor did we test like the gill structure. So you know, there's another study that actually showed that basically the fish in their study, because the whole outside of the fish is basically a mucous membrane, that the plastics were actually sticking to the whole outside of the fish and could be affecting the ability of the fish then to respirate, to breathe. Because the whole outside and the gill structure was basically becoming filled with these little plastic particles. And that's not something that we looked at. What we did was, you know, all of the animals that we looked at in that food web assessment were actually killed for other reasons. Largely fishermen, as they were coming to shore, we would offer to fillet their fish if they would let us keep the gastrointestinal tracts. And so a lot of the fish that were done in that, you know, that we analyzed in that survey, we looked at the gastrointestinal tract. The fishermen took the fish home and ate them. You know, so we're finding this plastic in the GI tract, and what does that mean for the meat that they then take home? We don't really know, right? We have to do these things very stepwise as scientists. So we extracted the gastrointestinal tract and then used a combination of a potassium hydroxide with a wet peroxide oxidation, two-step process in order to basically decompose the biological material and leave the synthetic plastics behind so that we could count them. So yeah, there's still a lot of questions with regard to the food web, but there's getting to be more and more data where, you know, basically groups are going to grocery stores and buying mussels and then analyzing those mussels that are intended for consumption by people, right, and analyzing those mussels and finding significant concentrations of plastic within those organisms. So, so I think that this actually does have pretty significant implications with regard to the fishing industry and kind of seafood in general.
Okay, we have a couple more questions here for you, Sherri. Just a moment.
Could you comment on the efforts to reduce this plastic pollution in water bodies, either by prevention? I know there's some effort in reducing these microbeads in this personal care products, and also if you are aware of any cleanup options that are being researched for the ocean gyres.
So, you know, I think with regard to kind of solving this problem, quote unquote, you know, you really have to look at it from multiple perspectives. You know, one is everything that we find out there ultimately comes from us, right? So if we reduce our use of plastic, then we reduce what's found in the environment, right? And so encouraging people to go as much as you can to go plastic free, right? So refuse to buy plastic water bottles. Remember to bring your reusable bags to the grocery store. You know, anytime I go to a restaurant, I always have to ask for my beverages without straws because they used to offer them to you and now they give them to you already in the drink. So, you know, I think those personal choices that we make, changing, you're right, you mentioned the personal care products, changing the personal care products that you choose to buy and use can dramatically affect, you know, what's in the water. So I think that's one step of it. But I think legislation is an important part of that too. I know, you know, there's a scientist who has expressed his frustration that the microbeads are becoming such a big topic and one that, you know, all this legislation is focused on. And he said, you know, basically there's bigger issues in the Great Lakes, and I don't disagree with him at all. There are bigger issues in the Great Lakes than microbeads. Microplastics are a pretty big issue, but microbeads themselves are only about, you know, 15 to 20% of the overall microplastic problem. And so yes, there are bigger issues, but I think, you know, we have to take one step at a time, and so I'm very supportive of the bans of microbeads, and I look at them as a stepping stone to getting more legislation in place, raising awareness. You know, in my mind, anytime we can get people to be aware of an issue in the Great Lakes, that helps all of the issues that affect the Great Lakes, because then people start to listen and care and think about their actions way, way more. You know, so we need to reduce, for example, the fertilization of our lawns and our farm grounds, because, you know, that's leading to runoff that leads to these algal blooms. And that's a serious issue too. You know, but you don't dismiss one because of others in my mind. So I think the legislation is important. A number of those companies that have used microbeads have said they're going to stop using microbeads, and I'm very appreciative of that and supportive of that. But unless you have the legislation in place that makes them do it, you know, it could just be basically tongue service, right, where they're saying that they're going to do something, wait for the issue to die away, and nobody notices that they didn't actually follow through with what they're saying. So I think you need both of those pieces. In terms of, you know, reducing, you know, actions to reduce, beach cleanups are helpful. The mechanical beach cleaning that occurs at many of these beaches in the summer, That's questionable because there's a number of studies that have showed that that mechanical beach cleaning actually breaks the plastic, as you have these heavy machines running across the beach to clean it, things that it doesn't pick up, it'll tend to break into smaller pieces, and so it may help with regard to the macroplastics, the big items, but actually increases the amount of microplastics. And the microplastics are a bigger concern. The smaller the piece of plastic, the more easily it's ingested. So, I think beach cleanup events are good. I think people changing their daily habits and becoming more aware of these kind of unconscious decisions that we make every day. When we go to a grocery store and somebody hands us something in a plastic bag and we don't think about it. We take it out of the store, and within 10 feet of being out of the store, we throw the plastic bag away. Or maybe we put it in a trash can, and then if there's a really windy day and it gets carried out of the trash can and ends up in the Great Lakes. So you have to think about these decisions that we make on a very small scale and how they affect us on a very large scale. With 7 billion people on a planet, it takes one thoughtless action from each of us every day, and that creates a major issue, right? So in terms of cleanup, so I tend to focus on stopping things at the source because that's ultimately how you fix a problem. There are people who are looking at cleanup, both with regard to the Great Lakes, looking at installing, for example, microfiltration at wastewater treatment plants. And more kind of prominently is Boyan Slate's work on the oceans, where he's looking to create this array of basically water cleaning machines. They look almost like giant spaceships, like something you'd see out of Star Trek or something, that sit in the water, and basically as the gyre moves the water, these large ocean currents, as they move the water, they move it through this machine. The machine spins the water to separate the plastic from the plankton. It spits the plankton back out, and it takes the plastic and it puts it into these large shipping containers, and then you go out, say, once a month and collect the shipping containers, bring them back to shore, and then can repurpose that plastic to make, say, headphones or jeans or something like that. I'm not against those efforts. My biggest concern with regard to cleanup ideas like that is that as a species, what we've typically done is that if somebody tells you, oh, we can clean it up, then nobody worries about the source anymore, right? You ask most people about reduce, reuse, recycle, and they say that they recycle. The first two steps are reducing and reusing and then recycling, especially with regard to plastics, because it is a material that is incredibly difficult and in many ways impossible to recycle. So recycling is not the solution. You really have to focus on reducing and reusing before you focus on recycling. And so that's where I focus. I focus on the reduce, but there are people that are looking at the other end of the spectrum.
Hey, Sherri, there's a couple questions online.
Okay.
If you would go to your questions tab, you can read those aloud, or would you like me to read them to you?
I'm on the chat, and I don't see anything here.
On questions, it's a different tab.
It's a different tab. Oh, I don't see. I'm sorry that I don't see a questions tab here.
Can you see the little questions bubble on the top? Oh, I'll just read them to you.
I'm so sorry.
That's fine. Do you know the amount of microplastics that are reaching drinking water plants intakes, or I'm sorry, the water treatment plant intakes, or are you aware of any studies looking into this?
That's a great question. I should have put that in the needs. I forgot about that. So, for the first couple of years I was giving these talks, I would always tell people, oh, I'm not worried plastics are in the drinking water. I'm not worried plastics are in the drinking water. But then this beer study came out from Germany. So it was a German beer study. They tested 12 beers off the store shelves, and they found plastics within the beer. And obvious reasons they chose beer, right? If you show that there's plastic in beer, people care. If you just say it's in your water, you're not necessarily going to get people to care. No, I'm just kidding. So they think one of the reasons that they said it might be in the beer is because it's coming from the drinking water that's used to make the beer. So it does call into question whether or not there's plastic in the drinking water. And to my knowledge, nobody has done a study like that. So I was actually recently contacted by a master's student from Wisconsin or Minnesota, I can't remember which, and she was looking for ideas, and that's what I suggested that she do, is basically redo the German beer study, but also look just at straight drinking water. Can you find plastics? I still think, if you ask most water treatment operators, you have to remember wastewater is very different than water in terms of how they're treated. So most water treatment operators would say that they can get down to the 1 micron or 10 micron level, which should eliminate the microplastics. I still think it's worth looking at, but nobody's done it. So the answer there is, we don't know.
Okay, next question. How will municipal bans of micro and nano particles be enforced given combined stormwater sewer systems allow bypass of effluent during these storm events?
Well, the legislation is on microbeads, and those really shouldn't. I guess you're thinking of combined sewage overflow events where sewage could get out. Well, then you really can't. I mean, the legislation is focused on the point of sale, not on their excretion, right? So it's not focused on the wastewater treatment plant, because really this isn't a wastewater treatment plant problem. This is a problem in design of a product. Products that are designed without thinking about the end life of the product. You ask most wastewater treatment plant operators, and they will rant up and down about these quote-unquote flushable wipes that are not flushable at all. They clog septic, they clog systems, they don't decompose, they get in machinery, they're a nuisance, right? So this is something that was designed like the microbeads. They were designed by one industry that didn't really think about the other end of the spectrum. And so these legislation is focused on those point of sales. It's saying you can't make microbeads, you can't manufacture them, and you can't sell them. And so it's really focused at that end. And how are they going to be enforced? By basically, the companies like, points of sale have to abide by the law, and it has to, so it's enforced at that level. So hopefully that answers the question.
Okay, Sherri, thank you very much for your presentation today. I think that's all the questions we have here. So we really appreciate you telling us about your research, and good luck with continuing that. And for those listening online or here, I want to just remind everyone that on October 22nd, we have our next seminar. That will be on water conservation. Karis Corporation will discuss what they've done with their manufacturing plant to reduce water use there. So we hope you all can join us for that next seminar. Thank you very much.